Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Any claim for a godlike entity must account for certain characteristics. For instance, God must be absolute, that is, non-relative, as well as first cause. Additionally, God, by definition, would possess the attributes all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful. These are the three most important criteria for any truth seeker. In this video, we'll equate these characteristics to something known, the mind. We'll argue that, stripped of its vantage point in individuals, such pure mind would be God itself. This will be done by our individually examining each attribute for absoluteness. First of all, energy by definition cannot exist without space-time. Look up the term in any dictionary and you'll see this is the case. This would include dictionaries related to science as well. Secondly, the simplest theory behind the Big Bang has it that the Big Bang created space-time. This assumes that there is only one universe, but what's relevant to this discussion concerns only the first of all universes, since, as we'll see, that's the only universe God needed to devise. What follows from this is that there is no space-time beyond the universes, thus no energy. So if the effect is space-time itself, then the cause of it must be transcendent of space-time, that is, beyond measure or observation. Overall, such cause would subsist, not necessarily exist, in the same manner that functions do of things, that is, as a foundation for existence. Its causality would be in the purpose of things, just as our own formless ideas, for example, our purpose for doing things, lead to physical actions. This is because such a cause must be eternal, that is, distinguishable from infinite in that eternity makes no reference to time. Since it's eternal, such a cause would not itself need a cause. It would be an eternal state in which timely events, for example space-time itself, originate from. Such a boundless state can be either nothing or oneness itself. Any oneness wouldn't be quantifiable until it's linked with other numbers. But since nothing cannot create, it must be one. As for its being transcendent, either it's something abstract or mind itself. Since abstracts cannot act, it must be mind. Since there cannot be more than one mind beyond space-time, as that would be measurable and quantifiable, then this mind must be absolute, without comparison. There can only be one non-relative absolute in this regard: certainty. Certainty is itself a state of mind, the most fulfilling thought. Thought implies consciousness. Consciousness is the most complex thing to exist, even more so than the inorganic universe. Accordingly, any discussion of first cause must account for consciousness as well. Since it's more logical for a lesser to depend on a greater than a greater to depend on a lesser, it's logical that such consciousness was created from an absolute rather than having emerged or evolved piecemeal from within. Otherwise, brains paradoxically would have originated from lifeless matter unthinkingly to become thinking things that think themselves. However, it's just as likely that our brains channel in consciousness than it creates it. For instance, anything examinable on a brain scan could just as much apply to a channeling mind as it could to a mind that originates thought. The source of that channeling would be a pure mind, a meditative mind without distraction. Even though pure mind is our cause, we cannot observe it directly or conceive of it entirely, yet it's knowable. It's knowable because we can rationalize its framework, objectively, albeit indirectly, by collective insight of our own non-observable first-hand nature of mind. Pure mind would simply be an extrapolation of the phenomenon we experience daily of thinking in general, albeit after the following considerations: that it's not directly observable. Individual minds perceiving an absolute wouldn't know if the knowable parts are its most important components, its least, or neither. Also, pure mind would have no opposite, and we can only fully perceive of that which has a known opposite. That is, every perceivable concept has an equally perceivable contrary. For instance, we wouldn't know of daylight if that's all we've ever experienced throughout our lives, and night never occurred. It would be as clear as day, yet we wouldn't know it. There would be nothing to compare it with. Likewise, our practical framework of thought wouldn't be the same as that of a pure mind. For instance, with pure mind, the unity of opposition would be prioritized over the law of non-contradiction. Logic's law of contradiction refers to time. A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect, whereas the unity of opposition is timeless. Overall, pure mind would simply be the unified, equitable sense of all such opposition. Being the unity of opposition, pure mind is simply one complete thought, yet even a complete thought may result in an epiphany. The epiphany that would have created a physical universe would be the thought of change itself. This thought resulted in infinite change. Change equals constancy. As the saying goes, there's only one thing that doesn't change, and that's change itself. And that would consist of all that this entails: relativity, measure, will, etc. If this weren't the case, and pure mind didn't create our consciousness, then any known accurate interpretation of reality on our end would be impossible. Truth would only be determined by whatever is practical at any given time, that is, pragmatism. Since such an absolute creator would be without distraction, and must have had clear intent, it follows that our creation, along with all other creation, has a purpose. Since our consciousness is the most complex out of all other known living organisms, our existence would be the end result of such purposefulness. There's one standard for every known consciousness. We're dependent, reciprocal creatures capable of possible suffering. Some would describe this characteristic as a fault of any creator of ours, but if we didn't have challenges, free will would be meaningless and morally irrelevant. Morality determines character. Even if free will doesn't exist, as some claim, for one to doubt it, one would still imply it. For one thing, consciousness in a relative world lends itself to it since relativity implies choices. Determinism, that is, the idea that our decisions are based entirely on our biological nature and environment, on the other hand, implies an absolute lack of choice. The knowledge of pure mind wouldn't be dependent on time. Pure mind would neither have foreknowledge nor post-knowledge, but simply have knowledge of all possible worlds. Free will would be consistent with absolute knowledge, as such time wouldn't be linear, but may be infinite to every possibility, only one of which would be realized in our space-time by our choices. The moral rules used to judge free will vary among cultures, but the idea of justice, which supports such stances, does not. Otherwise, we couldn't even debate morality among differing viewpoints, since we wouldn't be able to communicate its basis. Justice is a simple measure, for example, that all wrongs deserve to be righted, in that we must already know its basis of meaning in order to judge whether or not a moral code is accurate to follow. It entails the even simpler concept of goodness. For instance, happiness is said to have intrinsic value. Our purpose for doing anything seems to imply it as our goal, but happiness isn't identical with good, nor is pain necessarily identical with bad. Happiness, pleasure, and pain, being values, have characteristics. They're relations that must be referred to with something else. But unlike these relations, good is simple, irreducibly. Good equals good. It would be accurate to say that it subsists in the same sense that pure mind was described earlier. The most straightforward account of the simplicity of goodness was offered by Bertrand Russell's essay, Elements of Ethics. Whenever a proposed definition sets us thinking whether it is true in fact, and not whether that is how the word is used, then there is reason to suspect that we are not dealing with a definition, but with a significant proposition in which the word professedly defined has a meaning already known to us. So, as with justice, for anyone to judge whether a description of goodness is correct, we must already know the meaning of good intuitively in order to decide upon its accuracy. Essentially, morality involves feelings. Morality is only relevant to those creatures capable of suffering or understanding of it, so it's something all rational dependent creatures can identify with. The question reciprocally asked of morality is, how would you like it if someone did that to you? Given the fact that we're born with the same inborn dependencies, you may just as well imply anyone and everyone. In regards to feeling, it's significant that absence of pain and suffering is good, more so than absence of pleasure equals bad. For instance, a voluntary detox program may not be pleasurable, but may still serve an overall good. It follows then that the natural tendency to avoid pain is an even greater inclination than the abstract goal of happiness. We may conclude from this that injustice, is dependent on the possibility of suffering unnecessarily. Due to our limited perspectives, then, humans, either singly or collectively, should avoid carrying out decisions that would entail suffering to another. This is because we may likewise suffer too, and we would have no foolproof measure that any suffering involved is warranted. In fact, whenever evil is done in any so-called perceivably justifiable manner, the action is typically rationalized by the perpetrator as it being a lesser of two evils. However, such evils can never rightfully be done in the name of God, as warmongers and terrorists have attempted in the past to justify their wrongdoing. Recall that God is all good and a lesser of two evils are two incompatible concepts. One can never be applicable to the other. The rule here to be mindful of is as follows. If an action would otherwise be despicable without making reference to God, it should not then be carried out in the name of God. In general, God should never be used as an excuse for hate or suffering. So overall, in regards to experience, it's really justice, not good itself, that draws our attention to what is good. Even so, neither social contracts nor religious canons are as absolute as they're made out to be. For one thing, the possibility exists for unjust laws. Likewise, any interpretation of a specified God alone wouldn't determine what's necessarily right and wrong. For example, what if such a God commanded us to wear no woolen hats? Would it be evil not to follow this command, or merely inadvisable? Additionally, some of the New York City firefighters on September 11, 2001 may have done their heroic deeds out of a sense of religious conviction, but so arguably had the terrorist. Since justice entails goodness, the fundamental concept of good must still be referenced in order to determine whom of these actually fulfilled a heroic role that day. With that gauge, most would agree that the former have earned themselves the title of heroes, while the terrorist would rightfully be deemed as evil, due to their being the cause of inarguable suffering. In general, the goodness of pure mind would just be synonymous with goodness itself. Due to free will, and with morals being only relevant to living, feeling creatures, mind is only as good and as relative as we are collectively. Accordingly, our common function in being granted free will should be to achieve, through justice, the simplicity of goodness. As we've seen with Part 1, the Big Bang was the result of pure mind's epiphany of change. The universe is bound together by the weakest force. It only stands to reason that gravity advanced from a state less significant, likely not physical at all. But how could something metaphysical create physical things? Once again, the unity of opposition explains it. As we see with gravity, the weakest force is likewise the greatest. Essentially, the force consistent with an absolute will, allowing free will, is restraint, the unity of force-counterforce. As such, pure mind is strong enough to overcome and refrain from its inherent strength, for example, being merciful in regards to a transitory injustice. This stability to balance out the constant change offered by free will requires the force of moderation, equilibrium. It's not a state of feeling, but a state of being. Such a life force is understood in the East as chi, which we may all sense meditatively. The belief is to use up as little chi as possible, rather than squander it. Sages act accordingly. The sage doesn't affirm, nor does she distinguish, but acts non-intentionally. She does what's right at the right time, insomuch that the doing is negligible. Rather than be natural, sages naturally non-do. Otherwise, contraries are involved, and contraries involve extremes. Such ability becomes not only a lifestyle, but a state of intelligence. All of this answers the paradox. Could God create a rock he couldn't move? Positive moderation, restraint, prevents overwhelming creation destruction. Likewise, the best answer for a person to assure such a goal as heaven on earth is by subsisting oneself, avoiding extremes through moderation and balance. With goodness being our innate sense, and as our goal is to attain balance, the nature of pure mind would live through us. Pure mind, on its own and in itself, wouldn't have self-awareness. Rather, it is ourselves whom are self-aware. By looking within, we can experience a pure mind's interaction with us through unity. Transcendence equals immanence. That is, external equals internal. It's important for us to share in this inner nature. By doing so, we would escape our enslavement to self and recognize the spiritual bond of a universal perspective in all of us. The opposition of life-death need not entail one positive, one negative. Due to the unity of opposition, death is more likely a transformation than an end in itself. But in order for us to be in the proper frame of mind prior to transcending this life, every individual needs to willfully learn to think beyond their own self-interest and worries. Due to our being given free will, pure mind's sense of justice would allow the enlightened to abide in the highest ideals, that is, moderation and balance, whereas the unenlightened would live according to life's most petty aspects, fear, envy, desires, etc. Beyond this life, if those unenlightened who live only by the senses and self consciously live on, then they would do so without the senses or self. Such an eternal perspective would result in eternal unfulfillment with no hope. That is to say, hell. The unenlightened people then who go to hell would have freely sent themselves to such a state spiritually by their having been too unaccepting to live according to agape. Agape is a positive emotion that would be implied by the equanimity and absolute selflessness associated with the pure mind. It's an accepting, non-subjective type of loving that anyone will welcome regardless of whom does the loving. With agape as the goal, all spiritual paths would be essentially the same. As Eastern mysticism referred to this phenomenon, path equals destination. The journey is the goal itself. Such a goal wouldn't be a desire because the attainment would be accessible simply after one's first earnest effort or lack thereof to attain it. Overall, we evolved in order for us to realize free will and create our own meaning. Otherwise, we would all have been equal to a pure mind, a redundancy. If the world was perfect, then nothing would exist, rather all would subsist. As it is, though, we may all become sages, but as an end, not as a given. We're all born with pure mind's power of reason in order to overcome evil, if such is what we will. However, as things now stand, our technological know-how has far exceeded our moral grasp. Balance is therefore required from humanity's collective free will. So if our solutions only seem to bring on additional problems, it's only due to some imbalance of our collective reasoning. As a whole, humanity needs to advance its moral understanding. Hopefully this video had somewhat assisted the listener in establishing how such knowledge may be achieved. It would be in accordance with the understanding of all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful as consistent ideas. Thank you for listening.